Good evening, everyone. What a wonderful night. My name is Scott Korb, and I am the director of the Pacific University MFA in Writing program, and I am here to welcome all of you to the 7th episode, I think we're calling them, of the Mapmakers Alumni Institute, hosted tonight by Rhony Bhopla, featuring Shivanee Ramlochan and Rajiv Mohabir, friends of our program and all around amazing artists. Tonight's evening, Rhony will be leading us in a conversation about global perspective, ecopoetics and eco-writing. As I said, this is the 7th Mapmakers Alumni Institute event. The first year of this event were hosted by an alumni of Pacific University named Catherine Esther Cowie. And the last 2 episodes of the Mapmakers Alumni Institute were hosted by a poet from our program, Anel Champole. And the Mapmakers Alumni Institute was born from the Kwame Dawes Mapmaker Scholarship in a way for us to support writers who have come in with the Kwame Dawes Mapmaker Scholarship, writers of color who have entered our program with this merit scholarship. We support them within the program through their time in the scholarship. And now we have this 7 episodes in of the support that we can offer them institutionally through this Alumni Institute. And so I'm very happy to be hosting this tonight. And before long, I will disappear and Rhony will take it away. I'd like, before we get started, to offer a land acknowledgement. We in the Pacific University MFA offices are reaching you from Portland, Oregon, land of the Chinookan tribes who live near the intersection of the Willamette and Columbia rivers. Today, their descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Yakama Nation, and other tribal nations. As I say, your host for this evening is Rhony Bhopla. Rhony and I have had a long friendship through the program. Rhony, in addition to being the Mapmaker alumni this semester, was also a Mapmaker teaching assistant during her time in the program. And she was a great collaborator with me in a class we taught together. And I'm grateful for her ongoing friendship and her deep ambition and her care for the world. Rhony Bhopla is a poet and visual artist. Her poems in book reviews have appeared or are forthcoming in Notre Dame Review, the Ekphrastic Review, Cherry Moon, Emerging Voices from the Asian Diaspora, Pratique, Northwest Review, and Harvard Review. She is a rooted and written fellow and holds, as we know, a Master's of Fine Arts in Writing from Pacific University. When Rhony is not writing, she enjoys cooking and gardening. And I will say this as well, she enjoys sharing pictures of her cooking and her gardening. So without further ado, I will turn this event over to Rhony, Shivanee, and Rajiv. Welcome to Pacific, welcome all of you to Pacific, and I hope you enjoy this evening.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for that warm welcome. Marginalized communities across the globe are acutely experiencing without reprieve the devastating effects of a rapidly changing landscape caused by climate change. The 3 of us will talk about what we witness and the process of writing about the complicated relationships we have between civilization and the non-human natural world. While shortages of clean air and water, healthful food, as well as safe living conditions are contributing to morbidity and mortality, we are poised here to bring forward the writer's urgent messages and invocations, and we hope to inspire you. This, first and foremost, is a healing space, one in which we will share ideas and add to the grander conversation that is taking place across disciplines. I invite you to think about climate change and all of the things that we talk about today. And also, I invite you to write in your questions in the Q&A so that we can talk about those also, so that this is a collaborative space as well as a panel. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. I'm so happy to meet my idols on the virtual space. Rajiv Mohabir is the author of Cutlish, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry, the Cowherd's Son, winner of the Kundiman Prize and honorable mention of the Eric Hoffer Book Award, the Taxidermist's Cut, winner of the Four-Way Books Intro to Poetry Prize, and a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Poetry. And he is the translator of I Even Regret Night, Holy Songs of Demerara 1916, which received a Penheim Translation Grant Award and the 2020 Harold Morton Landon Translation Award. His memoir, Antiman, won the 2019 New Immigrant Writing Prize from Reckless Books. Rajiv is an assistant professor of poetry in the MFA program at Emerson College. Welcome, Rajiv.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Shivanee Ramlochan is a Trinidadian writer. Her debut book of poems, Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting, was a finalist for the People's Choice TNT Book of the Year and was shortlisted for the 2018 Forward Prize for Best First Collection. The Red Thread Cycle, the central suite of 7 poems from her debut collection, won a Small Axe Literary Competition Prize for Poetry and was on audio-visual display at the National Art Gallery at the Bahamas. Shivanee has been awarded residencies and fellowships from Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Malay Arts, as well as the Catapult Caribbean Arts Grant. She has served as a poetry reader and judge for Commonwealth Writers, Honeysuckle Press, Moco Magazine, and Forward Prizes. A Spanish language edition of Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting is soon to be published, and her second book, Unkillable on Indo-Caribbean Women's Disobedience, is forthcoming from Noemi Press in 2023. Welcome, Shivanee.
Thank you, Rhony. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you and Rajiv.
Thank you. It is really a true honor for me as well. This is a dream come true. I'm going to start by asking you some questions about this global perspective that I'm thinking of, which has to do more with the environment that's your locale. What do you think of when you think of the non-human natural world? Anyone can jump in at any time. I want us to have some foregrounding of what we don't see, perhaps in the Western side of the world or the Far East side of the world, somewhere in between, wherever you are located. What kinds of things do you think about when you think of nature?
I think, thank you, Rhony, for this question. I hope it's okay that I'm jumping in first. One of these things that I think about is, and what I love what your question points out is the kind of differences of cosmologies that where nature is centered or is not in the center, or the divides between human and animal are so incredibly big. I think, of course, first to mythology and Hindu stories, even my last name, Mohabir, which is, an epithet of the monkey god. And how is it that I can be named after a god that is a monkey? And how does that come into the human world and the close relationships between the animals and the devas? That's just one example, and as problematic of an example as that is, I think it shows a kind of ethics of that relationship, not to mention also the various animals that are associated with Hindu deities, etc. And that's what I think about Hinduism. There's also the idea of the ocean. And so for me, the ocean has always been this thing to be crossed, but then also a thing to whose our momentary inhabiting does and performs some radical transformations and metamorphoses, at least in my family history and my stories. So for example, crossing of the Kalapani, that black water in the 1800s, was one kind of transformation. In Guyana, I know my grandmother believed that every river was the sacred river Ganga, and every river leads to the ocean, making therefore the ocean Ganga as well. So there's also that kind of mapping onto diasporic locations and dislocations, etc. And then also, again, the crossing of the Kalapani in my generation into the United States as well has radically transformed my speech, my dress, myself. And so I think about, if there is a goddess, or I mean a god or a goddess most likely, then it is the ocean who's in control of, you know, life on Earth, be it through water system, etc. And so then what does it mean for us to live, you know, in this kind of way where, you know, we're poisoning our waters, etc. So this is like one of the first things that occurs to me, you know, water and animal relationships between people.
Yes,
Very literal.
I love that, because you're bringing in the elements of what our conversation is going to touch upon. For example, anthropomorphism, also the relationships we have with nature. And Shivanee, would you like to add something about your locale, and then we'll jump into some art. We'll start with art after that.
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Rajiv, for that response to it. I think I have been trying for as long as I've been in this practice as a writer to understand the psychogeography of myself. And what I've come to learn is that the ways in which I thought my landscapes were foreign to me have changed over time. They've some emotional, psychological, and spiritual terraforming has taken place, and it has everything to do with how much access I give myself to the land, and how much I'm willing to receive from the land as a collective, universal, yet also quite specific entity that is primordially alive, that I think that I know will endure past our human devastations upon it. And I think the idea of extinction within a Caribbean literary framework might terrify a lot of people, but I, for one, have made a kind of peace with the fact that we do not deserve the earth that we currently inhabit. And so the idea of an eventual human extinction seems more than likely. And so it then becomes even more pressing to make work that is in harmonious surrender to that. And if I'm going to surrender to anything, it will be the land. It will not be to a man. It will not be to God. It will not be to male gods. It will be to a force that is truly, truly greater than myself, that I can only ever hope to understand through a combination of divination, intuition, and as Rajiv was saying, the cultural inheritance of my ancestors and the very specific journeys that they took.
I love how both of you sort of merged in this sort of field of humility. And this field of humility is very soothing to me. It goes along with the healing part of acceptance. And in a way, we're humankind in a mode of grieving. And we are grieving currently due to the pandemic in real time. And so this humility is a palliative for us, I think, for us to accept certain things that we do not understand. And I love the mention of the bodies of water. Yes to the eventual extinction if we are to keep moving in the direction that we are. So let's move into the art. I'd like for us to hear some of your works that you think we would, just be able to feel some sort of connection to in terms of this topic of eco-writing or ecopoetics. Shivanee, would you like to go, and then we'll go to Rajiv?
Sure, I think in the first instance, I will share just the one poem and take my cue perhaps from how Rajiv wants to respond to that as to whether I'll read any more. This poem is written as part of a collaboration with my dear friend and colleague poet Andre Bagu, who is also a Trinidadian poet and a journalist and a critic. And I don't often write what I would call collaborative poems, but we were charged by a commission to respond to the reality of global warming in the Caribbean, and to do this collaboratively. And if I had any doubts about being able to write a collaborative poem with anyone, I shouldn't have worried. In the case of doing this work with Andre, what we ended up doing was forming a poem that is in effect a response one to the other in the form of poem letters. So what I'll read is my main contribution to that. And as you'll hear, it harkens to some very preternatural Caribbean tropes and literary establishments that some might argue deserve to go down in fire, but I will let the poem speak for itself. The world's oldest woman offers herself for dissection. That canny empress, ripped from her colony, shielded the lucifered tallow with her madness, trailing torn lace and nitrous promise through Thornfield, staked through their mad hearts with sargassum seaweed. All mad women understand it's better to consume the manse with fire. It's better, if you can, to light the lamps on your pathway to hell. To protect myself from burning, I stuffed my old heart full of sphagnum moss. I lay down in the bog of the Cretaceous country and begged for a loamy death. Let every soil cradle me when it's time to go. To keep the fire from the trees, I ate them. Scissor me surgically, and you will find bromeliads from the botanic gardens functioning in place of my pink lungs. Come closer. Lean in. The Guyana Shield Wetland Forest balances on my breastbone. Roraima Amazon reservoiring upward into my suprasternal notch. Cut me there and let loose the waterfall. Remember, as I'm laid out in an amphitheater table, what I've said about mad women is that we mark the cycle of living and reforestation through fire. Forgive, if you can, the smell of burning human flesh. When the world was first beginning, there was a forest. You can see that, can't you, staring at my insides? Peel back the flesh curtains. Jigsaw this mountain range from that one. Witness how deciduous and strange it was. There one, delivered mad as I am, into our green basin, sanctified, arboreal, calcified soft tissue, zero-burned skin as sucker vines, unclassified by modern science. No, I tried to keep growing things alive. Even now, in the year of our fall, 1001, when we are hotter and more intemperate than any combustible hell.
That is amazing. One thing I have to say without any doubt is that your endings just rock me. Thank you for rocking me throughout. Thank you. Rajiv, would you like to share a piece with us?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, wow, I'm kind of scared to read after Shivanee. There was one thing that you said, Shivanee, that made me think of that Merwin poem for a coming extinction. You know, he calls the end as an extinction, that great God. And I think like that's such a like a powerful kind of metaphor. And thank you for like invoking that poem for me. I'm going to read two short poems. The first one is, and both of these are from my forthcoming collection in 2023, and it's called Whale Aria. The first poem is a whale song poem, and when I say whale song, and I think we're going to get to this kind of in the conversation, I've kind of mined the song structure of the humpback whale as written about by Eduardo Mercado and Roger and Katie Payne, excuse me, to expose a poetic form that, you know, in my small human understanding, I could engage with the aesthetic practice of, you know, this wonderful submarine song. And it has a very particular structure and order. I'll give you an idea of what it looks like on the page. Can you see where it says plastivore? Okay, so it's in tercets. There's a particular rhyme scheme that correlates to humpback whale song, as well as a kind of formal anti-closural gesture that happens in the poem. This first poem is called Plastivore, and it was inspired by this quote from the poet Stephen Collis, who wrote, "Humpback swallow 6 parts plastic for 1 part plankton." As we know, there are these great plastic gyres that are swirling in our oceans. And I'm on sabbatical, and I just was on this research trip to Hawaii, where I went to Waimanalo Beach, and I spent 10 minutes just picking up the plastics that I saw. And these are all of the plastics that I've seen, that I saw in that 10-minute time, without actually moving from the one place that I was sitting in. So to give you an example of what these plastics look like a little bit more clearly, you can see they're just these like little fragment things that are like no bigger than a fingernail. You know, of course, there's also like frayed rope, etc. So this poem is called Plastivore, and it's about this idea that this is filling the bellies of our cetaceans. Pick a pectoral peck of polycarbonate particulates. Wreath the shoal in bubble nets. Open your teeth. Swallow polyvinylidene chlorides, polymides, every kind of toothbrush to scrub baleen, and microdot hand wash. Now heat a canticle cycle. Soften, cool, harden. Look, you splash in the kingdom, genus species of plastic, glommed to gut. After bones, dust, a pile. What other remains endure? I was so surprised to learn that in the Anthropocene, you know, this era that we're living in, there are new kinds of substances around, and one is called a plastaglomerate, and that is plastic that is melted to stone. And the plastaglomerate can change and be of a different kind depending on the substance, the kind of plastic, as well as the kind of rock. So this next poem is perhaps a little bit more happy, I suppose, because we do need joy in our lives, and it kind of speaks a little bit to this idea of ecology being related to white supremacy and colonization. This is called Comeback, and I'll say that a little thing that you should know is, and I wanted to go from Hawaii and I wanted to bring it to the Pacific Northwest to you all, and this is actually in Bellingham Bay, that in 2016 the humpback whales started to return to this bay, and they're returning to New York City, and so this is kind of like an excitement for me. Comeback. Returning to Bellingham Bay, humpbacks lunge into krill clouds. Cetacean resurgent stuns August mackerel shoals, northern blooms now at silver capacity. Whalers once drove rorquals to markets as lamp oil and umbrellas. What is a body but to be rendered? In 1907, 500 white men shook East Indians from prayer, broke dholak drums, pushed out who they called Hindu hordes. We are still being flensed of papers, stripped to the quick in public. And yet, in America's thieved straits, I sing dark-bodied chutney. Listen, the Salish salt again hums. Off Semiahmoo Bay, see a cow teach her yearling to blow a toroidal vortex. Despite whale irons, ruin, despite expulsion, get out scrawled on our temple walls, we return. To our summer Qawwali Kirtan, we return, while flukes beat the drumskin sea.
Gorgeous, gorgeous poems. And I'm glad that you read that piece, Rajiv, because one of my questions here, and I think about this a lot, is how neocolonialism permeates the arts, and how do we make that connection to our environment? And you did that so beautifully in that poem. And I was wondering if you could elaborate just a bit on what kind of thinking went into that poem, how you're connecting past, and how there is sort of this ongoing fervor that's experienced while we hear you say those words. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think that the kind of commodification of the world and of our resources is ongoing. The thing that gets me really, the writer part of me, super excited. That's a creepy thing to say, but the thing that makes me super intrigued, I guess, artistically, is to think about the global economy that kind of was around the whaling industry, and how it connected all parts of the world through the proliferation of whale products, including oil and, like I said, whalebone for umbrella and corsets, and things you wouldn't even think of, why is there whale meat in my dog food kind of thing, and how that period of really intense whaling kind of is the same period of Indian indenture in which my own history was inflected, right? 1838 to 1917, that was prime whaling years, for the mechanized industry in North America, and specifically in the United States, that connected both Massachusetts to Hawaii, where I was, trained, I suppose, formally in thinking of coloniality. And so, for me, those connections as an artist, I hold them loosely, although we can trace very clearly the relationships between how no people of color were allowed in the Pacific Northwest, and they were actually kicked out, in the early 1900s, and that kind of white scarring and legacy that's left its imprint in the area. I'm living in a town called Malden, on land that belongs to the rightful caretakers, known for being of the Pawtucket Confederacy. And the kind of history here also, there was because of colonization, because of the kind of global capitalist engine, folks from the native folks from here were imprisoned and sent to Barbados. And so there's always been that kind of conversation happening. And after the moments of decolonization, it never ended with NAFTA, of course, with the IMF and the World Bank, opening up to people in the global South to these liberalized economies. Anyway, and so that's just really scratching the surface.
Right, I agree. And my experience when I lived in Grenada, just to bring it to the Caribbean, where Shivanee is actually located in Trinidad currently, is that there was this obliviousness that happened with people coming in, and that's that whole re-education of history that is missing. And I felt connected to something when I was there. That was in 1997, but I couldn't really figure out what it was, because the people there seemed to know who I was, but I didn't know who they were. And so it required me to learn more about what my connection was to this island. And there's so much to think about when we think about neocolonialism and how it is an ongoing situation, an ongoing assault, really. And it really goes against the healing aspect that we really are wanting in our lives. And I want to invite Shivanee to talk a little bit about what that idea of neocolonialism is for you, Shivanee, and what is it that, how do we connect that process, if you will, to our relationship with the natural world now? And how do you see it with the communities that you are with now?
The prospect of post-colonial rule is in itself deeply flawed, which makes neo-colonialism just as flawed. There's evidence of how Caribbean people struggle to escape colonial strictures of respectability, of being above reproach, of being clean, upstanding, morally sound citizens. And so patterns of trauma and abuse replicate themselves in our communities because the education of any group of us trying to outlive our collective trauma must be nonlinear, because we weren't traumatized in a linear fashion, even though it was systemic and it was calculated. And so patterns of neo-colonialism that now emerge make a really appalling kind of sense to me, because they're predicated on that root system of deep hurt, which is synonymous, of course, with how we hurt the planet that we live on. Because we can abuse the land and we can despoil the water. Not only for the fact that it seems infinite, though we know it's not, but because it's there to abuse. And it's that feeling of growing up in a hostile environment in which you are the recipient of hostility. And as we all know, that pattern can go one of several ways, but often it goes the way of finding a vessel to release your hurt and your rage into. And so often that's people who we deem to be inferior or weaker physically or mentally than us, and what is more recipient in general understanding than the land. Because how does it actively fight back? Well, we see how it does, because I think we live in a climate crisis that goes from one devastation to the next. And so I believe people are beginning to kind of comprehend that through neocolonialism and its effects, which I think is very strongly tied to the specters of post-colonial rule, we are very ill-equipped to wage war with a planet that is dying and angry at us.
Yes, that's so telling, Shivanee. I want us to move our conversation back to the art as well, because, you know, and before I do that though, this is what I think about currently, is how writers like us who write about nature, who care about nature, how do we dissolve the divide between our actual practice of writing and our production of writing and the realities that people outside of our writing scope feel and experienced. It's not to say that it's not the age-old question, does poetry matter? That's been a question that has been overdone, right? But we agree that writing and poetry matters, yes. So not just us, but I would like to say most people do think that writing is important. And within the scope of this conversation, though, my thinking has always been, how do I get rid of that gap between what I do, what I am as a writer, and how do I communicate the importance that the important work that I'm doing to deal with the climate change, deal with what I witness, and demonstrate that to people who do not consider themselves writers, because we're talking about all disciplines. We're talking about business. And if you want to look at any faculty list at any university, business, mathematics, engineering, all of those fields are addressing this topic within their field. How do we, and I know this might be a big question, how do we demonstrate to other disciplines that we are also part of this conversation, that we are in fact eco-writers, we are eco-poets, and we have the same concern? Any thoughts about that, Rajiv?
Yeah, well, thank you for this question, because it is deep in terms of interrogating what our aesthetic practice and our practice of writing does in the world in a way that's a little bit about opening up possibility, as I like to think of it. I was lucky to hear the writer Julian Agwan read from his latest book, No Country for Eight-Spotted Butterflies. And in this book, he does this, well, not in the book, in the talk, actually, he was saying like how, you know, the very fact of his writing about the environment, it has to be interdisciplinary or genre expansive. Thinking about writing as being siloed into only like, you know, only an artistic practice is to kind of miss the potential scope for what the writing can do. I really think that, and I really hope that, you know, my efforts, I can link even more fully into other kinds and spaces of activism. Like the activism that I've been involved with has been what I think of as literary activism, and also like the activism that is, you know, teaching, whether it be at the ground level of the community or in the larger, or this other kind of like rarefied university level kind of teaching. I do think that it is like any kind of instruction can also be have this activist bent, or it can be quite the opposite, right? It can reify again and again the kinds of really deep grooves of you know, siloed identities, you know, white supremacy, etc. So that's the thing. And then on the other hand, like, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, Shivanee, I'm thinking about like the god of that is extinction too, and thinking about what matters is doing what we can now, right? I mean, I think that I mean, this is so cliche to say, but the future, there is no future, there's only now, right? I mean, and I think that if we kind of embody that a little bit fully as poets, which poets do, you know, just kind of like by our training, we linger in the moment, we make associations. If they're, and that always, in my own personal belief, has a political charge. And so I'm wondering also about that, being more open about the interdisciplinarity practices that we embody. It could do this thing to open it up, you know, to kind of cross those lines of, oh, I'm a chemist, you know, there's no reason for me to think about Hegel and Marx, but maybe there is.
Any thoughts about that, Shivanee?
I think it becomes increasingly incumbent upon us to interrogate what we mean by participation. For example, tonight, as is not uncommon for many events of this kind and others that take place in a Canadian or North American context, we began with a land acknowledgement. And certain communities might say that the utterance of these words is ultimately self-serving and happens in a fetishistic silo. And perhaps the people who might say this are those who could stand most to benefit from actionable, practical restitution of that, or tangible suppositions of care. On the other hand, what is the value that we predicate on the utterance for someone who, for example, I come from a culture where land acknowledgements are not common practice. What is the effect of hearing the muscular and vehicular urgency of having it being said, often not by accident, by white cisgender people? What does that do to the psyche? Is it positive? Is it ameliorative? And so if what we do remains largely in the realm of something that is not tangible, to me, that's still deeply functional. If my call to action as a writer, which I suppose is a call I've called upon myself, really, is to pay the most steadfast attention I can to something, usually the unsayable thing in my society, and then to say it as clearly as I can with all of the expression that I have. That's not passive work to me. Language is not passive work. So the work of chemists, mathematicians, people who ratify and codify and formulate is deeply important, but so is the act of utterance. And yes, absolutely, language has its limitations, but it also makes everything possible, like tonight, like us here. And I want to believe that there is a kind of steadfast activism in putting one word after another into a dangerous place and believing that it does work.
Oh, so beautiful. So beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to let you know that we have 30 minutes before our Q&A. So for our audience members, I encourage you to take notes. I encourage you to bring in your own ideas in your questions. So please put those in the Q&A. And I would like to also ask a little bit about this clarification of terms, because writers like ourselves have been writing about nature for a very long time. We can trace it back to centuries and thousands of years, but The word Anthropocene has been mentioned also, and Ecopoetics, and I'm going to throw in the age of naturalism. What are your thoughts about some of these terms, and how do we place this conversation within that terminology? Because if a person says, I'm an eco-poet, they may need some sort of context for doing the work that they do, perhaps historical, or perhaps a definition that they make up of their own, or something that is based on theory. What are your thoughts on some of these terms? Rajiv, you're shaking your head. Perhaps you have something to add.
Oh, no, yeah, no, thank you for this question. I think that for me, in my kind of like understanding of this is that, we talk about the pastoral, as a mode of poetry that exists up until 1962, and with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which really interrogated, what was happening in the world, and that kind of writing became eco-critical in a way that it sidestepped the pastoral, or it implicated the people, the lovers of the pastoral. There's also a kind of division that happens in my understanding of this, is that there's the human natural divide that happens a lot in the pastoral. Eco-poetry or eco-criticism as a movement, is a movement, can and sometimes wants to bring back the separated halves of the human and the natural back together. So, for example, we think of living in in this air-conditioned room as being something unnatural. No, it's not, because humans invented it, and humans are very natural. So it is a natural thing. And so, like, the divisions here refuse that binary. I think that also, and this is like, can I give you some like cynical tea, because I'm messy and I lived it for this stuff. But I think like eco poetry starts to embody a very specific aesthetic, that there's a received way of writing eco-critical and eco-poetic works that, is just aesthetic practice. And for me, that's my hot take, in that, why can't something that has pastoral leanings, that implicates us and unsettles us, even if it occurs in a lyric mode, why can that not be eco-critical? Why does it have to, do something else? Or why does the meaning have to be lodged outside of the language in order for that to happen? And so that's what I say. Anthropocene, though, is like the human age. And I like to think of that in terms of, look at how many books I have on my bookshelf. How possible was this for someone of my class standing at ethnicity 100 years ago? Probably not very. And so this is the Anthropocene, in that like we have all of these things that are available to us. And to connect back to a little bit of what you asked about the neocolonial, it's like, I think about this specifically. I'm talking to you from my Mac computer. I know that the minerals and chemicals found in this Mac computer were mined from Papua New Guinea, where there are horrible land atrocities and people being murdered, and land being completely damaged. Like, looking at how the mining happens, it's catastrophic. But you know what? I still need my Mac computer to talk to you tonight, so I can do my work. And so, I mean, I'm not absolving myself from my complicity, but I'm also acknowledging this complicity. This is the Anthropocene. I'm creating works that contest the mining in Papua New Guinea and the human rights violations happening there on the computer that is a child born of that kind of particular exploitation. This is the Anthropocene.
That is the Anthropocene, yes. And I wanted to kind of latch on to a few things that you mentioned in your response, was that the implication of self and how that fits into our own writing. I think Shivanee beautifully began us with some, sense of where we're headed, this transitional period, perhaps an extinction. And I was looking through some of the poems, Shivanee, from your collection, your first collection, Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting, and some of the words such as deforestation and some of those things just kind of lit me up here. But I was thinking about, and you just stirred this in me, is this implication. from the traditional standpoint, from the received form of the ecopoetic tradition, I suppose, is that idea that one has to be implicated in one's poem, or something has to be implicated. Shivanee, any thoughts about the implication of something, someone in the poem, rather than talking about the natural world? How do you address this in some of your thinking and writing?
This is a really profound question, and it reaches into so much of what I've gone over in my head about my practice, especially in recent years, about to what extent do readers expect to see an embodiment of the self reflected in the poems. Not even so much feeling upset or uncomfortable that anyone would. I understand the human impulse to relate and to forge meaningful bonds. But then what does that do to the artist under a certain kind of pressure, whether it's a pressure I apply to myself? I'm not accusing anyone of applying it to me. Or if it comes from invisible strings I can't see. And it's, Rajiv mentioned the pastoral mode and how it has to endure in our imagination. And there is a way in which Rajiv, you may have noticed this too, you both may have, rurality coming from the bush, coming from the anything that to the metropolis sounds like uncharted terrain has I think begun to feel rather exotified in a very specific way, cross-culturally, cross-racially. And certainly there's an appetite for stories from people who inhabit the margins of spaces more than there used to be, at least in our Anthropocene. And so how to resist that impulse to fetishize the self, whether autobiographical or semi-fictional, while also telling the truth about the land. I can't escape writing about the land. I don't think of myself as an eco-poet, but I can't think of myself as apart from nature. And it's ecopoetics to me seems like so many things we haven't had names for in our Caribbean literary tradition. Before there were young adult novels, Caribbean writers and other writers too were writing books aimed at the hearts of young people. And so is the term an umbrella that provides us with a communal shelter that we need from the acid rain, or is it a noose, or is it a bear trap in the woods? I don't know if I have the answers to that, but I do know. What I do know is that when I'm writing anything, I can sense when I'm in danger of losing myself to the wrong way in it. And I think if I follow that impulse to resist commodifying myself, then hopefully I can do the same thing in the service of the land I'm writing about. And that's very much my intention when I move to the page, to try to write about Las Lomas, the village where I grew up and spent my formative years as a young person, or the uncharted spaces in the Caribbean that rich, usually white tourists can just buy wholesale and live on their own private reserves. How to write about these places without ticking certain invisible boxes. It's an ongoing, I don't want to say struggle, it's an ongoing challenge that I feel really grateful to have space and time to think about.
I like that you've ended that way, because you ended what you just said, because I thought of the word struggle, but then you changed it to challenge. It really does speak to the privileges that we have, but also the opportunity that all three of us have at this moment in time, given our ancestry. And I do have that challenge of feeling like I'm commodified, that I'm being exposed, and what is the cost, and who is seeing themselves in me as a writer, and what responsibility do I have to the place that I have, what are my origins, the people in my life, what responsibility do I have to those places and people, and is my writing strong enough to deliver a succinct message saying that I'm with everybody on this topic. I'm not just with the people, my community, I'm with everyone. But at the same time, it's a leveraging that is extremely hard for me. And I was wondering if Rajiv, you could add to what Shivanee said, or Shivanee, you can say something more about that.
Yeah, what I'm struck by from what Shivanee said was this kind of like radical honesty. You know, the showing and exposing of the self, and how, you know, how that can actually be emotionally costly. And yeah, I wonder about that, you know, how to then, you know, even go forward. I think, you know, speaking and allowing a kind of analysis is the wrong word, but like, let's say a poetic moment or instance, or some kind of lyric interiority, to expose the kind of world and in the net of identities and communities that you belong to from that honest and radically honest perspective, actually opens up the conversation more than we could imagine, I suppose. And this is anecdotal and kind of off topic, but kind of on topic. But like thinking about Cutlish, that book that I've done, and just like how rarefied that language is, and who says that anymore, and what's the point of writing in, you know, these languages that, you know, were a home space to me, if people aren't going to understand it. It's not universal, right? It's not the universal experience. And I was like, it's my goddamn experience, you know, like these are the soundscapes that I grew up in. It matters to me. It matters to people who will feel seen by it. And it's funny because I think that this book it's reached such a wide audience in a way that I never expected that it would. And so, I mean, I guess that just goes to say that radical honesty, and even if it is, and it is incredibly costly emotionally and super risky, it's definitely worth that gamble, let's say.
Thank you for addressing that very, very sort of intimate space that we share. But since you mentioned language, I mean, I have to say, Bhojpuri is something that I will continue to practice through at least from the page, and then perhaps you can share a few of what your Aji shared with you. And for the audience members, I'm referring to Rajiv's recent memoir. You can see a picture of it right to his left, and I'm referring to Bhojpuri, which is the language of his Aji. And the book was so moving and was very vulnerable in that sense that both Shivanee and I are sort of exploring in this sort of space here, is that vulnerability that we want to have, but it's the door sometimes is so thick, the hinge is so heavy. And both of you have done that in remarkable ways in both of your publications. Let's take a brief pause from that intense moment there and talk about something that you've already touched upon, which is social justice. You know, we're in a queer space, everyone. I don't know if you know this. I'm of the LGBTQ community. You know, at the start, I mentioned marginalized communities, and that is a fact of today, Monday, October 31, 2022, is that marginalized communities of all aspects are experiencing the immediate effects of climate change and the changes within their locales. And I want to ask simply, you know, how are you seeing that happen? Some of Shivanee's already mentioned it a bit. Could you go a little bit and take us with you on that journey of experience where people are sharing with you what they're experiencing as a result of not only marginalization, but in addition, the pandemic or changes in their environment or lack of food? What do you say?
Rhony, I'm so sorry. Were you addressing me in this question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Either one of you, if either Shivanee or Rajiv want to hop on in this answer train.
Rajiv, do you want to answer first, or shall I?
Well, you please.
My most honest and instinctive response is to say that it's very difficult to hold the stories of others sometimes when they reach out to you with an honest response to the work, which is not to say it's not a deep privilege to be in a position to receive it. In my history of sharing space within communities in the context of my poems, a lot of the received stories that I try to make room for have to do with surviving sexual violence, which, of course, as everything is deeply connected to the relationships we have and also that abusers have to the land. Trinidad, in its geography, increasingly feels like an unsafe place for women and non-binary people. And that has a lot to do with crime and the politics of crime. It also has to do with how spaces are progressively open to menace and to threat, and how grim advances lurk in places that are ostensibly safe and what is safe. And so a lot of the conversations that I try to hold space for have to do around this very thing. How, as a Caribbean person, was not a cisgender male, does one move in a space that feels radically opposed to one's survival? And I don't think I was conscious of wanting to create this dialogue when I wrote the poems that are, specifically the poems that are in the red thread cycle in Everyone Knows I'm a Haunting. I was simply at the time trying to make a space for the underheard, but it's a whole, and you can both relate to this, it's a whole different prospect to advance the conversations beyond your poems, because the poems do that themselves, of course. They insist on their own dimensions always. And what a profound joy and honor that is. And so in my queer communities, in my communities of fat and non-binary, female identified, creative people, as they intersect across the Caribbean and its diaspora, a lot of the conversations we continue to have are about sexual risk, sexual harm. And increasingly, and I think which is very relevant to what we're sharing today, that has to do with how we inhabit ourselves, how we try to insist on occupying a certain kind of space, and how we focus on letting the land hold us when other systems can't hold us, when other systems, in fact, are prone to breakage because of all kinds of reasons that we've been discussing tonight.
Yes, I thank you for that, Shivanee. It's a it's not something, I mean, I just finished Rajiv's book, and I remember certain parts where I was just so moved by those moments when there was a searching, Rajiv, searching for a space. As just as a queer person, you're just, and the nature is the nature within, but also the nature that surrounds us, and it's only air that separates us from that nature that is so unaffirming and so unaccepting. And sometimes there is no opportunity to really feel connected to the natural world, because the navigation of our own personal space is being inhibited. And so I want to thank you both for being so open about your struggles as queer writers, because that also is a space that I saw myself in when I read your works. And I think that even answers one of my earlier questions about what is the role of our writing. Is poetry a valid thing in terms of ecopoetics or eco anything? Is that ecology of existence? Is that ecology of humanity? So thank you. I'd like to just do a quick check on the Q&A, and then we'll see if there are any questions, and then we will definitely end on time. So are there any? There are a couple of questions. One is from Laura Rosenthal. Laura, thank you for your question. Can any or all of you address whether or how your activism coexists with what Rajiv called harmonious surrender to devastation and extinction? So how does your activism coexist?
I'll say that brilliant language in quotes, the harmonious surrender, that brilliance was all Shivanee's.
Thank you for that, Rajiv. Because it's 1:40 a.m. here, I did wonder if, I know you and I have an incredible neural connection as poets. I did wonder if some of the language slipped from my head into yours and back again, which would have been perfectly fine, and I would have been at peace with. But I can speak to this, or Rajiv, you can first if you'd like.
Oh, you please.
I, again, maybe at the risk of sounding repetitive, I do struggle with this. It is not in my nature to surrender. And there are all kinds of complex reasons that are, I will confess, rooted in a lot of trauma for that. But I've made a kind of political foothold in the world by being unrelenting, which, as we all know, has finite resources, like the planet, right? And so when those resources of being sovereign and unfuckwithable run out, what do? And as much as I've been trying to answer this question as a poet, I've tried to answer it as a human being. It's very difficult to face up to the idea that we are a finite race, and that our resources, I think, do you know what is the most difficult thing about it as a literary activist? Is knowing that it's possible in our lifetime, despite the most valiant efforts of the best and bravest of us, in which I don't necessarily count myself, it is the actions of mega corporations that will determine the future of the world we exist in. And that makes me profoundly heartbroken. But I think from that heartbreak is where I try to mine that harmonious surrender. And if my heart is broken for the planet, as much as it can be for anything else, what do I do with that pain and sorrow? How do I how do I transmute it or alchemize it into something useful for others? And I think back to when I wrote these poems about sexual violence more than 10 years ago now. And the need to just connect any way I could to anyone who was feeling like an open wound of devastation, who was feeling like that they themselves had gone extinct from their own lives. And to try to reach them and say, I understand that feeling, I understand in my own way. That's where I can allow myself to submit to the need to care. And that my care will not be in vain, despite what mega corporations do. That if I plant a tree, and Rajiv plants a tree, and Rhony plants a tree, then that will still be 3 trees, even if the seas are choking with plastic. And that, as Rajiv said, we can only do what we can do. So to try to properly sum up my response to your question, Laura, I would say my activism in this particular coexistence is very fraught, because to do it, I have to fight with the part of myself that has taught herself to be militant about my own survival. But I realize that militancy can only carry me so far. And I try my best to be open to the softness that requires.
And you are open, I like the last, what you said, you are open to the softness. And this goes back to the fact that there is a healing space for you, Shivanee. There is a healing space for you, Rajiv. And to know that while you say there are those mega corporations that are leading the way through and over and in all of the ecology that is inevitably going to go extinct, if we think that way, that there is a space for us, belief and hope that there is a space, there is. Rajiv?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I love the kind of thing that Shivanee has said, and it reminded me of the saying that I read, in the hour, if the day of resurrection is about to be established, and one of you is holding a palm shoot, let him take advantage of even 1 second before the hour is established to plant it. And what I love about this hadith is that, it shows this kind of like forward motion. I mean, like, even if there isn't a great human extinction, it's only the humans that will be extinct, right? And so like, maybe that surrender is beautiful. Surrendering to this is beautiful. But I'll also say, like, what I see and how I tie this to my own kind of activism kind of is in this way, is that I'm very much of the belief, and I know Shivanee is also, because I've witnessed Shivanee do this, is that, like, I'm of, in this like place where I hold institutional privilege. Or so it looks like, right? I mean, as an untenured tenure track professor, like it's kind of hard to say that I don't have institutional power. Institutional power is like a little questionable. Anyway, that said, my whole kind of ethos around this is to kick down that goddamn door and let as many people in as possible. And quite honestly, whether it's through editing work, whether it's through mentorship, whether it's through conversations, however, inviting writers, marginalized folks of color into the reading series, or looking over friends' manuscripts, offering advice and that kind of thing, promoting their work, interviewing them, etc. It's and I've been saying that I've been calling the name Hawaii for so long in our talk tonight. I want to direct you to this video by the Kanaka Maoli poet Sydney Iokea, who talks a little bit about the overthrow of Hawaii. But anyway, just to say also, like, how, for example, like, being in Hawaii was so instrumental into the way that I see the concerns of my poetry, as well as the ecology of the world. And like being in the Pacific, folks who are feeling the brunt of ecological climate shift disaster intensely with the flooding of the islands of the Marshallese Islands, this climate justice that people have been like calling for. I've also been moved by like what I've been seeing on the news and on TikTok of, like people like throwing liquids upon the Van Gogh in the museum, as well as on The View, these two women who were like, demanding during the filming that the hosts address climate change specifically here and now. And I want to say that there's a kind of thing that happens also when marginalized folks are given space to talk, is that the conversation shifts radically and dramatically. And that's how I say I would tie these things together without being so incredibly prescriptive.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you, Shivanee. The next question is from Bhavna Mehta. Who or what do you consider your literary lineage? You want to take that one, Shivanee?
Oh, for a long time. This, of course, ties in with that idea of trying to make myself rely on only myself, which again, as I've been sharing, is definitely a trauma-rooted response. But it meant that in my literary practice, I resisted the idea of having what I suppose I thought of as idols, different kinds of gods. But thankfully, that inflexibility has relaxed a great deal. And I'm at the point in my practice and in my life where my literary foremothers in particular and where the forefathers exist, they mostly happen to be queer male writers, have been life-saving. And every time I hesitate to claim them as an inheritance, I just think of the times their writing has saved my life. And I think of the poet Federico Garcia Lorca, who created the most agonizingly beautiful things in closeted despair, for the most part. And a lot of my inheritance of writers I prize and cannot envision the world without, they also happen to be alive, which is a great, great joy. If lineage could be thought of as parallel to what we experience now, I suppose my lineage also includes Rajiv very specifically. If we are writing into the same vein of existence in very different and very intertwined ways, then the company that we keep on this journey is so important, especially if, as we're seeing, we're doing it in the context of a failing planet, that we have failed. Then even more so, the company we keep becomes intensely urgent. So writers like Rajiv and Gayatri Bahadur and Andil Gosain are actively writing into that vein, trying to resist a world that will end in despair. And I'm profoundly grateful for them.
I'm grateful with you, Shivanee. Thank you. And I can share, and since the question asks the three of us, I do look back at some of the writers that I saw myself in, but now more so it's contemporary writers who, like you, are writing. And one of the primary reasons is I know that women writers have not been given access. And so it's really hard for me to say what my lineage is if it doesn't go beyond 50, 60 years. Bharati Mukherjee is one of my favorite writers, but Rajiv and Shivanee, you're part of the company that we keep, right? I mean, I think, and then also people like Kwame Dawes, Shara McCallum, Matem Shifarao, who have all been very instrumental in my it's almost like you see a baby walking into a wall and you pick them up and then you put them on the right track before they walk into the wall. That's how I felt when I met these people, and I thought, oh, I was going in the wrong direction. So at the risk of going over time, I'd like to read Stephanie Pierce's question. I think, please offer your beloved list of art in these spaces. And I think what Stephanie might be meaning is the list of publications. And I think Scott will provide those to us again at the end of the episode. Donna Spirits Metz, I would love you to speak a bit more on how you envision transdisciplinarity in ecopoetics. How can we indeed work to transcend the silos between disciplines for quote, for good, for instance, in Jane Hirschfeld's work? I'm not sure if you're both familiar with that work. I know I haven't had a chance to look at it, but how do you envision transdisciplinarity in ecopoetics? So that kind of touches upon the question or the comment I had about going to other disciplines, basically, to try to breach that distance between what we do as writers and what is being done out there beyond the writers. What do you say, Rajiv?
I think of Donny Che's actually Hardly War and how that is very transdisciplinary. And I wonder about, the eco-critical work or work that has like attention towards the eco will do this. I wonder if the engagement can be even a little bit deeper in terms of contemporary research and what that looks like with the production of the book. I know that there are a lot of folks that do that, like, that they're doing it now. I think that I envision the transdisciplinarity, and this is my own kind of thing, is a way to kind of like, I mean, readership is a weird thing to say, but to like broaden the kind of like categorical readership of who interacts with poetry specifically, or if in nonfiction, with that also to reach into those other places. I mean, poetry, I think, is like, I feel as though it's like the hardest sell of anything that I've written, in meaning that there are fewer readers of my poetry than there are, let's say, of the memoir. And I think that for me, in order to reach those people with the poem, with the eco-critical concern, I think that that would kind of open people up to the possibility of self-transformation as they go through the poem themselves. Like that whole notion that literature increases empathy. What if like eco-poetry could do that in a larger way? And like Shivanee says, like it's not the necessarily individual choice, but these massive corporations. I'm not saying that like I should write poems for the conglomerates of the world, but rather that this transdisciplinarity can take that into effect. Like we could mine those manuals even, or what the Department of Justice has to say about the effects of military sonar in the Pacific, using those, implicating the language, also the self, also thinking about how we can use and use the mechanism of the Anthropocene to kind of diffuse or to get the potential for that kind of change out.
Thank you, Rajiv. And Donna clarifies, I was referring to Jane's Poets for Science situation. The link is right there if anyone wants to click on that. I would say this is our final question, and then we will end with perhaps a few pieces from both of you, and then we'll turn it back to Scott for a final goodbye. Beth Russell asks, can you talk more about specific strategies for working within institutions to create space for marginalized perspectives, voices, peoples? How do we confront these forces without reinforcing resistance to change? And I'm going to add to that question, is that how do we not be voyeurs? Also, I'm going to add, because voyeurism with our cultures that are removed, it seems like as I kind of alluded to, the writing is happening, but it's not, the body of work is not there. So who is writing is important, and also how do we confront these forces without reinforcing resistance to change? So I'm kind of throwing everything in there all at once. Shivanee, you want to take that one?
Part of what I do for my living is I help to run the Caribbean's largest English-speaking literary festival, which is called the Bocas Lit Fest. It's been running for 12 years. It's an organization I'm tremendously proud of. It's a festival Rajiv has been to, and several other writers from across the Caribbean and its diaspora. And it would be easy enough to look at 12 years of success. But I also view my role as a festival founder, co-founder, and a progressive and subversive feminist as increasingly intersectional. And so I refuse to be part of a space like that, or indeed any other art space in the Caribbean that does not make room for trans affirmative voices. I have no space within my body or my soul for turf politics. I feel deeply passionate about making Caribbean literary material accessible to those who are differently sighted, or whose auditory perception is different to the vast majority of the hearing world. And it's in the Caribbean space, with its limitations to funding, which is often at the core of how these things progress through education and development. It would be easy to, it's a very delicate balancing act, because on the one hand, we have come as far as we have come through our own industry, and often in spite of so much bureaucracy and gutter sniping and awful politics. But the reminder that as organizations that profess to be about the greatest and broadest span in the reach of the arts and culture, what we can offer to our own people, all of them, wherever they live in the Caribbean, has to constantly be evolving. And so it's that act of balancing the success of an organization run by people who are very passionate and overworked and cannot do everything all at once. And the realization that people everywhere are deeply deserving of respect, and the acknowledgement that they are human. And I felt it important to answer this question as a literary organizer more than a poet, perhaps, because that's where a lot of my institutional privilege is. That's where I draw my salaries from. That's the job title that often prefaces me into the world. That's often how I make introductions. If I'm gaining and deriving power from this, how am I going to use it? How am I not going to be someone who stands by and says nothing if someone makes a transphobic comment, or if budgets don't get allocated to closed captioning? I can't respect myself if I do those things, and so I refuse inactivity and silence.
Thank you, Shivanee. Rajiv, would you like to answer the question, and then we will then have a piece from you, and then
Sure.
and end with a piece from Shivanee. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess for me, it's a question of who is at the center. And as a teacher of poetry, I ask myself that a lot, not just representations of the poems or the literature that we're studying, but who is writing the craft that we are discussing? Is it all cisgender white folks? If so, then why am I centering that? My question is also, like, why does craft have to always be explicit? I gave this kind of like critique of like the received tradition or the received aesthetic practice. And I think that is that its poetic lineage is white supremacy, and fascism, to be quite honest. So I wonder about these things when I teach, and so I see work as being inclusive of people's abilities, genders, and sexual orientations, as well as race and ethnic categories, as not ever being the extra bit. That is the main thing for me. And so when I design a class, we look at mostly, writers of color and folks of, other kinds of non-normative, backgrounds in our white supremacist space. And I work in a primarily white institution, and this is something that I do, and I won't be told to do it any other kind of way.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you both. Rajiv?
So, yeah, so like I said, you wanted me to read a little piece, and this is a very, very fresh piece. Like I said, I'm on sabbatical, and I was just in Hawaii, and I was writing about, humpback whale ecology while I was there, putting together, the cumulative whale watching journals and thoughts that I had for over a decade. And this is going to be a very quick essay that I read to you. It's like a flash essay. Once I saw a whale spout from Waimanalo, though it is rare, because it's protected by a reef, or a fallen volcano whose mouth extended from Waimanalo to Kailua to the Nu'uanu Pali. In a 10-minute gathering, I was able to find a Gerber jar full of plastics, most no bigger than my pinky fingernail, in one place as I sat down in the sand. No one really knows why whales breach, but some biologists think it's for fun. What if it's to splash away plastics? This would be a communication to us. To communicate indicates audience. Are they hoping we are receptive? Individuals are not the culprits. Our choices matter, of course, but not as much as the pollution allowances of governments like the governments the world over, and especially in the US, known for being the most wanton, insatiable consumers. Land, air, sea, space, this country wants to own it all in its failed modernist project of national identity. Even though the humpbacks are opportunistic feeders in the Hawaiian waters, they do eat here by lunging after sparkling schools and shoals of fish. Their feeding patterns, notwithstanding the Hawaii fast, include group and cooperative feeding in Alaskan waters using bubble nets and belly flashes, where the subpolar gyre clouds the water amidst the algal blooms and capelin and sardine shoals. As they lunge with their mouths open, their throats' ventral pleats expand, and they're capable of taking in 5,000 gallons of water that they push out through their baleen, made of keratin hanging from the robe, hanging in their mouths. The frayed baleen functions as a filter to catch all the prey species for the humpback. Using their tongues, they guide their food towards their grapefruit-sized throats. When they lunge into clouds of fish, their impressive jaws also engulf countless plastic shards, which they then swallow as a result of it being mixed with their food. From this, plastics enter the whale biome, and we all know, and if you don't, shame on you, that plastics never biodegrade. They break down and poison us. Some plastics for medical reasons actually aid human life. I'm dependent on plastics for my medicines for diabetes, without which, and without whose waste, my life would most likely be considerably shorter. They called the new element of plastic melted onto rock a plastiglomerate, a new substance of the Anthropocene. But what of our biological constitutions? Are we now new beings, bioplastigglomerates, made partially of plastic, filled with it?
Fabulous. And thank you so much for sharing some of your fresh work. Thank you. Shivanee.
So I often struggle with writing poems that center on happiness. But I wrote this poem as a wedding present for two of my dear friends, one of whom is the poet Danielle Voodoo Fortuné, who's a very dear friend of mine, and she is truly the archetype of a wild woman steeped in the traditions of the bush and its healing properties, and how a return to the land can be deeply nourishing and restorative for all of us. And her partner is very much the same way. And when I despair of the world, which I do often, I sometimes think of them and the way that they're raising their two young children to value what is green and good and simple and rooted. And so this poem is for Danielle, and it's called La Criatura Handfasts the Forest. For Danielle Voodoo Fortuné. She took a husband on the riverbank after casting for his hearth taro through the coppice of his leaves. Wayward she borne, bush delivered and sudden, like leaping moray tail slicing current. Let no man say she never knew what she wanted, or grew unable to track her mate by the swells of Matlock. She took him by the branch, charting the progression of her sons in his aspect of bay leaf and tamarind. She knew him by his ease, by the light in his forests that let in all her several sisters, solstice fox, pinnacle egret, the swan who kept seasons by the shiver of wings against the woman's naked breast. She knew her husband by the way all his trees whispered, "Shine, bring me your creatures, those you saved from chainsaw and gravel hunger, from instrument of color and clamor and human want. I have homes in them for me." Relentless she chose and married him with a silver leap, claiming the residence that vetivated her wild skin, knotting wedding rings like balata hearts in her palms.
Thank you. Thank you, Shivanee Ramlochan. Thank you, Rajiv Mohabir. Everyone, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Be well.